They found me crouched by the car, my arms wrapped around my knees, shivering so hard my teeth clicked together. I was covered in mud, cuts on my arms and legs, mosquito bites swelling into angry red lumps across my face. I must have looked like something clawed its way out of a nightmare. The older one, a man with a faded baseball cap and a cigarette tucked behind his ear, crouched down and spoke softly, like you'd speak to a spooked dog. "Hey kid, you all right? You hurt." My voice was stuck somewhere deep inside me. I opened my mouth to answer, but all I could hear was that laugh. That deep, wet gurgling sound. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the image was still there, seared into my mind like a brand. That crooked, too wide smile. "Kid," the man said again. His hand reached toward my shoulder. "It smiled before it killed them," I whispered. My own voice sounded foreign to me. Dry, hollow, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "What?" The other one, a woman with a ponytail and a skeptical frown, stood a few feet back. I lifted my head. My lips trembled. It smiled, before it killed them. The man and woman exchanged a look, the kind of look that says this kid is messed up. They asked me what I meant, but I couldn't tell them anything else. I just shook my head over and over, and eventually they stopped trying to get answers. I don't think I could have explained it anyway. I couldn't even begin to make sense of what happened. But now, looking back, I think everything went wrong the moment my dad decided to take that road. It was supposed to be a fun family trip. Nothing fancy, just a quick getaway before school started back up. Dad had this big, romantic idea about teaching us to love the open road. He was always talking about how people are too glued to their phones and computers these days, how we don't appreciate nature anymore. So he packed us into the car, me, my sister Lila, and Mom, and took us through the most backwater, mosquito-infested stretch of America he could find. It was somewhere in Louisiana, I think. The swamp stretched out on either side of the road, black and endless, dotted with towering cypress trees draped in ghostly curtains of Spanish moss. The air smelled heavy and sour, like wet leaves and decay, and the heat made everything stick to your skin. Lila had her earbuds in, probably trying to drown out Dad's lecture on the beauty of untouched wilderness. I just stared out the window, watching the swamp roll by like a green-brown ocean, broken occasionally by the glittering surfaces of still, murky pools. At some point, we stopped at a gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. The guy behind the counter, an older man with leathery skin and a cigarette stub that seemed permanently glued to his bottom lip, looked up when we walked in. "You folks headed toward that way?" he asked, gesturing vaguely in the direction we were going. Dad frowned. "Yeah, why?" The man scratched his chin, his nails leaving streaks of grime behind. "Ain't much out there. Just swamp and more swamp. Reckon y'all might want to stick to the main roads." Dad smiled politely, the way he always did when he thought someone was being overly cautious. "Thanks for the advice, but we'll be fine. Just looking for some peace and quiet." The man didn't smile back. He just nodded slowly, like he didn't believe a word Dad said. The car broke down about 20 miles later. "It's probably the alternator," Dad muttered, crouched under the hood as the engine ticked softly in the heat. I stayed close to the car, swatting at mosquitoes while Mom and Lila argued about whether or not we should call for help. "We don't have service out here," Mom said, her voice tight with irritation. "I told you this was a bad idea." "It's fine," Dad said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "We've got the tents. We'll camp here for the night, and I'll figure it out in the morning." Lila groaned loudly, rolling her eyes so hard it was a miracle they didn't get stuck. "Camping? Seriously? Out here? It'll be fun," Dad said, trying to sound enthusiastic. "An adventure." Nobody else seemed convinced, but by the time the sun started dipping below the horizon, it was clear we didn't have much choice. We set up the tents in a small clearing off the road, trying not to think too hard about the swamp just a few feet away. The noises started as soon as the sun was gone. At first, it was just the usual swamp sounds, frogs croaking, insects buzzing, the occasional splash of something hitting the water. But as the night wore on, the sounds began to change. The frogs went quiet. The insects faded into the background, and in their place came something else. It was faint at first, like the sloshing of water too far away to matter. But then it got closer, louder. The sound of something big moving through the swamp, slow and deliberate, like it wasn't in any kind of hurry. "What's that?" Mom whispered, her voice tight with fear. Dad shook his head, his face pale in the dim glow of the campfire. "Probably just an alligator," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. The noise circled our camp for what felt like hours, coming closer and then retreating like whatever it was trying to figure out exactly where we were. When I finally crawled into the tent and zipped it shut, I was too scared to close my eyes. I lay there, staring up at the nylon ceiling, listening to the swamp. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is Lila shaking me awake. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "Eliot," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you see it? Out there, in the water." She pointed toward the edge of the swamp, where the firelight faded into darkness. I didn't want to look. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to look. But I did, and that's when I saw it. When I pointed toward the shadowy edge of the swamp, my hand trembling so hard it looked blurry in the dim firelight. Dad barely even glanced in that direction. "There's nothing there, Lila," he said, running a hand through his sweat-damp hair. His voice was calm, but the way he avoided looking too long at the water betrayed him. He was scared. "No," Lila whispered fiercely. "I saw something. It was big, standing right at the waterline, staring at us. It had these glowing eyes, and it wasn't enough." Dad's tone hardened, but he still wouldn't look at the swamp. "It's late, you're tired, and your imagination's running wild. It's probably just a bird or a raccoon, okay? There's no monster in the swamp." Lila glared at him, her jaw tightening, but she didn't say anything else. I could see her chest rising and falling, fast and shallow, as though she was struggling to breathe. Mom tried to smooth things over, the way she always did. "Sweetheart," she said softly, taking Lila's arm. "Why don't you get some sleep? We're all just on edge because it's so dark out here. You'll feel better in the morning." Lila yanked her arm away and crawled into the tent without another word. I followed her in, not because I was tired, but because I didn't want to be left outside. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the wall of the tent, listening to the sounds of the swamp. Lila lay next to me, curled into a tight ball, her breath shallow and uneven. "It was watching us," she whispered suddenly. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Whatever was out there?" Her voice cracked, and she sounded so sure, so certain, that I couldn't dismiss her like Dad had. "It wasn't an animal. It was wrong. It looked like a person, but it wasn't." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. We both stayed quiet after that, straining our ears, waiting for the world outside to tell us if she was right. The noises started up again around midnight. The first sound was faint, just a soft splash in the distance. Then another, and another. The rhythm of the splashes felt deliberate, purposeful, as though something was moving toward us. Lila stiffened beside me. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "Yeah." I breathed. I prayed it would stop, but it didn't. The sounds grew louder, closer, and then, suddenly, something scratched against the side of our tent. Lila gasped, grabbing my arm so tightly it hurt. I froze, my entire body going cold. I stared at the wall of the tent, where the faint outline of a hand, or maybe claws, dragged slowly down the fabric, leaving a faint squeaking sound. "Dad!" I called out, my voice breaking. There was no response. Another scratch, this time on the opposite side of the tent. Then a faint sniffing sound, as though something was trying to smell us through the nylon. "Dad!" Lila shouted this time, her voice shrill with panic. A few seconds later, Dad's voice called out from somewhere near the campfire. "It's just a raccoon. Calm down." Lila shook her head violently. "That's not a raccoon. That's not a fucking raccoon." "Language," Dad snapped, but his voice was thin and wavering. The scratching stopped. For a few moments, the swamp was silent, the air thick with tension. I could hear my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Then came the breathing. It was faint but deep, an inhale followed by a long, wet exhale. It came from just outside the tent. "Mom!" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The breathing stopped. When dawn finally came, it brought no relief. The swamp was quiet, too quiet. Even the mosquitoes seemed subdued, the usual hum of their wings absent in the heavy morning air. Dad emerged from his tent looking haggard, his face pale and his eyes bloodshot. Mom wasn't much better. Lila didn't say anything as we packed up what little gear we could and prepared to figure out how to get the car running again. That's when I saw it. There was a tree just a few feet from our camp, an old cypress with its roots knotted into the ground like gnarled fingers. On the bark, just below where the lowest branch stretched out, were 3 deep, jagged gouges. They were long and parallel, as though something with claws had raked across the trunk. "Dad," I called, pointing at the marks. He came over, squinting at the tree. "Huh, probably a bear." "It's too low for a bear," I said. He shrugged, but I could see a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Let's just focus on the car." We never got the chance. Lila was the first to notice. She had wandered off a few yards to find her water bottle, which she swore she left near the fire the night before. "Mom," she called out, her voice uncertain. "What is it?" Mom asked, but Lila didn't answer. A few seconds later, Mom and Dad realized she was gone. "Lila," Mom called, her voice climbing with panic. "Lila, where are you?" We spent hours searching, shouting her name until our throats were raw. Mom was crying, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, while Dad stomped through the brush, cursing under his breath. I stayed near the camp, too scared to go far. It was late in the afternoon when they found her. I heard Mom scream first, a sound so raw and primal it didn't sound human. Then Dad shouted something I couldn't understand, his voice cracking like glass. When I ran to where they were standing, I wished I hadn't. Lila was hanging from one of the highest branches of a cypress tree, her body limp, her head twisted at an unnatural angle. Her arms were torn open, the skin flayed back to reveal glistening bone. Her legs dangled like broken branches, blood dripping down to pool at the base of the tree. But her face was the worst part. Her eyes were wide, her mouth frozen in a scream, her expression one of pure, unfiltered terror. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I just stood there, staring up at her until Dad grabbed me and pulled me back toward the camp. "We need to leave," Mom sobbed, clutching at Dad's arm. "We need to leave right now." Dad didn't argue. For once, he looked just as scared as the rest of us. That night, we didn't even bother setting up the tents. We just sat huddled together by the car, waiting for morning, knowing deep down that nothing was going to save us. We didn't bury Lila. Dad said we couldn't. Not in this place. It was too wet, too dangerous. Instead, he said we'd let the authorities handle it when we got out of here. When we got out of here, he said it with such conviction, like he actually believed it. I didn't. Mom sat with her back to the car, her knees hugged to her chest. She hadn't spoken since we'd found Lila, except to quietly cry into her hands. She was pale, almost gray, like all the blood had drained out of her. I'd never seen her look so small, so breakable. Dad paced in front of the car, muttering to himself as he checked the engine for the 100th time. Sweat dripped from his forehead, mixing with the streaks of dirt on his face. "Just needs time to cool off," he said for what felt like the 100th time, his voice tight. "The alternator's fine. We'll get it running. We'll get out of here. Just give it some time." "Time?" Mom finally looked up, her voice sharp. Her eyes were red, her face blotchy from crying. "We don't have time, David. Lila's dead. Someone killed her, and you're sitting here talking about cooling off the damn car?" Dad's jaw tightened. "I know you're scared, Sarah, but we have to stay calm." "Calm?" she spat, her voice breaking. "I am terrified. Do you even understand what's happening here? This isn't a bear, or a wolf, or whatever you're telling yourself it is. This isn't natural." She gestured wildly toward the swamp, her hands trembling. "This place is wrong, David. It feels wrong." I sat silently beside her, clutching my knees to my chest. I didn't want to interrupt. I didn't want to move. I didn't even want to breathe. Dad leaned against the hood of the car, his hands gripping the edge so tightly I thought the metal might dent. "We can't just walk out of here," he said, his voice low and measured. "We're in the middle of nowhere, and we have no idea which direction to go. If we make a mistake, we'll get lost in the swamp, and that'll get us killed a hell of a lot faster than whatever you think is out there." Mom glared at him, her lips trembling. "We're already going to die out here." By the time the sun dipped below the trees, plunging the swamp in a shadow, we were no closer to leaving. The car was dead. Mom had given up trying to convince Dad to leave on foot, and Dad had stopped trying to convince himself he could fix the engine. The fire was the only thing that felt like it might protect us. Dad piled on as much wood as he could find, stoking the flames until they roared high enough to cast flickering shadows across the surrounding trees. "We'll stay close to the fire," Dad said, his voice strained but steady. "Animals don't like fire. It'll keep them away." Mom didn't argue. She just sat by the flames, staring into the dancing orange light, her hands gripping my shoulders like she was afraid I might disappear if she let go. The noises started again just after nightfall. At first, it was the same as before, soft splashes in the distance, the occasional rustle of leaves. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew louder, closer, more deliberate. Something was circling us. Dad sat by the fire with his back straight, gripping a large branch he'd sharpened into a makeshift spear. His knuckles were white, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. "Just stay calm," he whispered, though it wasn't clear if he was talking to us or himself. Mom was trembling. "It's watching us. I can feel it." "Stop," Dad snapped, his voice low and harsh. "Don't start that again." "She's right," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I couldn't bring myself to look directly into the dark, but I could see it. Movement at the edges of the light. Shapes shifting and sliding between the trees. Too fast to see clearly, but too big to be anything normal. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Dad, what is it?" "It's an animal," Dad said firmly, though his grip on the branch tightened. "Just an animal." "No," Mom said, her voice flat and cold. "It isn't." Dad turned to her, his face flushed with frustration. "What the hell are you saying, Sarah? You think it's a ghost? A monster? You're scaring him." He jabbed a finger toward me, his voice rising. Mom's expression didn't change. She didn't even blink. "Something evil lives in this swamp, David, and it's coming for us." The argument didn't last much longer. Whatever was out there didn't give them the chance. The noises grew louder, sloshing, scraping, dragging. It was the dragging that got to me. It sounded wet, heavy, like something enormous was pulling itself through the mud. "I'm checking the perimeter," Dad said suddenly, standing up and gripping the branch tighter. Mom's head snapped up. "No, don't leave the fire." "It's fine," he said, though his voice wavered. "I'll just go a few feet out. I need to see what's out there. I can't just sit here and wait for it to come to us." "David, don't," Mom pleaded, grabbing his arm. He pulled away gently, but firmly. "Stay here. Keep the fire going." And then he was gone. I don't know how long we waited after that. Time felt strange, stretched, warped. The fire popped and crackled, the shadows around us growing longer as the flames began to shrink. "David," Mom called out, her voice breaking. There was no response. A faint splash echoed from somewhere out in the darkness, followed by another. Then came the dragging sound again, wet and deliberate. Mom stood up, her body rigid, her eyes scanning the trees. "David," she called again, louder this time. The dragging sound stopped. For a few moments, the swamp was silent. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my entire body frozen in place. And then it came, a soft thump, like something heavy being dropped into the mud. Another splash. Something moved just beyond the firelight. Something massive, its shape distorted and alien. I caught a glimpse of it. Slick, scaly skin reflecting the dying firelight, long limbs that bent the wrong way, and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide into a crooked smile. Mom grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the car, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. "David!" she screamed one last time, her voice echoing through the trees. But he was gone. After Dad disappeared into the swamp, everything fell apart. Mom clung to me like I was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality, but I could tell she was slipping. She sat by the fire, rocking back and forth, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her hands shook so violently that I thought she might drop whatever she was holding, until I realized she wasn't holding anything. Eyes, she whispered over and over. In the dark, watching. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know what to feel anymore. There wasn't room for sadness or anger or anything else. Just fear. Mom, I asked, my voice small and trembling. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the swamp, wide and unblinking. Do you see them? She whispered. I turned to follow her gaze, but all I saw was darkness. The fire was starting to die, the flickering flames unable to push back against the shadows. See what? I asked, my stomach twisting into knots. The eyes, she said, her voice barely audible. They're watching, always watching. We didn't sleep. Not really. I sat beside Mom, trying to keep the fire alive with what little dry wood I could find. Every time the flames dipped lower, she flinched, her hands twitching toward me like she was afraid I might disappear too. Stay close, she whispered. Don't let them take you. Don't let them. She stopped suddenly, her body going rigid. Her head snapped up, her eyes darting toward the swamp again. What is it? I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't answer. She just stared, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her nails dug into her arms, dragging down her skin until they left red streaks behind. I reached out to stop her, but she didn't seem to notice. Mom, you're hurting yourself, I said, grabbing her wrist. She blinked, her eyes flicking down to her bleeding arms like she was seeing them for the first time. I'm fine, she muttered, yanking her hand away. But she wasn't fine, not even close. As the hours dragged on, I noticed other changes. Mom's voice started to change. It was subtle at first, just a slight monotone creeping into her words, but it grew worse the longer we stayed by the fire. She started speaking in short, clipped sentences, her words strange and disjointed, like she wasn't really talking to me anymore. Too quiet, she muttered at one point, her eyes darting back and forth. It's too quiet. It doesn't like the quiet. It's waiting for us. What's waiting? I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. She just stared into the darkness, her face slack, her mouth slightly open, as though she was listening to something I couldn't hear. At some point, I must have dozed off. When I opened my eyes, the fire was little more than glowing embers. The swamp was eerily silent, the usual chorus of insects and frogs replaced by an oppressive, suffocating stillness. And then I heard it. It started as a low, guttural sound, deep and wet, like the rumble of an animal's growl mixed with something human. The sound sent shivers down my spine, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The growl rose into a grotesque laugh, wet and gurgling, like something choking on its own saliva. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. Mom, I whispered. She wasn't beside me. Mom, I said again, louder this time. The laugh stopped abruptly, replaced by the faint sound of something squelching, like feet sinking into mud. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around the campsite. She wasn't there. Mom! I shouted, panic rising in my throat. A faint voice called back, soft and distant. Eliot! I turned toward the swamp, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice came again, louder this time. Eliot, come here. It was Mom's voice, but it sounded strange, too calm, too flat, like she was speaking through a layer of static. I hesitated, my legs trembling. Mom, I'm here, she said. Come to me. The firelight didn't reach far enough to see where she was, but I followed the sound of her voice, stepping closer to the water. My foot squished into the mud as I reached the edge of the swamp, the cold muck seeping through my shoes. That's when I saw her. She was standing waist-deep in the water, her back to me, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Her hair clung to her face in wet strands, and her head tilted slightly to the side, as though she was listening to something in the distance. Mom, what are you doing? I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. Mom, I said again, louder this time. She turned slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide and glassy, her pupils so dilated they looked almost black. It's calling me, she said softly, her lips curling into a strange, empty smile. "Who's calling you?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. Her smile widened, and she took a step deeper into the water. "It wants me to come." "No!" I screamed, running toward her. "Don't go, please." I grabbed her arm, but she yanked it away with a strength I didn't know she had. She turned back toward the water, her body stiff and rigid. "It's waiting," she said, her voice a monotone whisper. "I have to go." "Mom, stop!" I sobbed, grabbing at her again, but before I could pull her back, something grabbed her. It happened so fast that I almost didn't see it, a blur of movement beneath the water, followed by the flash of something long and sharp. She screamed as impossibly long claws wrapped around her waist, dragging her under with a violent splash. "Mom!" I screamed, falling to my knees at the water's edge. The swamp was still again, the surface of the water rippling faintly as though nothing had happened. "Mom," I whispered, my voice breaking. And then the laugh came again, low and gurgling, echoing out from somewhere deep in the swamp. When the sun rose, it didn't feel like morning. The swamp was wrapped in a thick gray fog that muffled the world, choking the light and muting the sounds of birds and insects. I sat by the dead fire, shivering despite the heat and humidity. My clothes were soaked in mud and cold sweat, clinging to my skin like a second layer. They were gone. Dad, Mom, Lila, all of them. I was the only one left. For a long time, I didn't move. My legs felt like they didn't belong to me, and my head swam with a feverish fog. I clutched my knees to my chest and stared into the swamp, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Maybe for Mom to come crawling out of the water, smiling that strange, empty smile. Maybe for Dad to call my name from the shadows. Maybe for Lila to scream again. But nothing came, just the silence. Eventually, the hunger gnawed at me enough to force me to my feet. The food was still in the car. I stumbled toward it, my legs trembling, and wrenched open the door. The smell hit me first, rotten, sickly sweet. I gagged and pulled my shirt over my nose, squinting into the back seat. The cooler was still there, but the food inside had gone bad. I grabbed a pack of crackers that looked edible and stuffed a few into my mouth, chewing mechanically, not tasting anything. The smell didn't go away. I checked the rest of the car, looking for anything useful, anything to help me get out of here. That's when I noticed the claw marks. They were on the roof of the car, long and jagged, cutting deep into the metal. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away, staring at the marks. They hadn't been there before. Something had come to the camp while I slept. I decided to leave. The campsite felt too exposed, too vulnerable. If I stayed, it would find me. I didn't know where I was going or how far the swamp stretched, but I figured if I followed the road long enough, I'd eventually find someone. At least, that's what I told myself. I slung the pack of crackers over my shoulder and stepped onto the dirt road, glancing back at the empty campsite one last time. It looked smaller than I remembered, almost like it was being swallowed by the fog. Then I started walking. The swamp didn't want me to leave. At first, I thought I was making progress. I walked for what felt like hours, my shoes squelching in the wet dirt, my lungs burning from the humid air. The fog clung to me like a wet blanket, thick and oppressive, but I kept moving, certain I'd eventually break through it. But I didn't. No matter how far I walked, the road stayed the same. The same twisted trees, the same knotted roots, the same stagnant pools of water that stank of decay. I passed a fallen log that looked suspiciously familiar and felt my stomach drop. I started running after that, ignoring the sharp pain in my side and the burning in my legs. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until I collapsed onto the road, gasping for air. When I looked up, I was back at the campsite. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. I stumbled back into the clearing, my legs shaking, my head pounding. The fire pit was still there, a pile of ash and charred wood. The tents were still standing, sagging slightly from the weight of the damp air. The car loomed on the edge of the clearing, its windows fogged with moisture. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, and the sound caught somewhere in my chest. That's when I saw it. It wasn't standing in the clearing. Not yet, but I could feel it watching me. The weight of its gaze was heavy, suffocating, pressing down on me like a physical force. My head turned slowly, almost involuntarily, toward the trees. And there it was. The fog blurred its outline, but I could see enough to know it wasn't human. It was tall, too tall, its head tilted slightly to the side as if it was studying me. Its skin was slick and scaly, like the belly of a snake, and its limbs were long and gangly, bending at strange angles. But its face was the worst part. It had a mouth full of jagged teeth, crooked and uneven, stretching across its face in a grin that was far too wide. The corners of its mouth stretched up toward its eyes, which glowed a sickly yellow, like a pair of lanterns floating in the dark. It didn't move. It just stood there, grinning at me. I don't know how long I stared at it. Time felt strange, elastic, like it was being stretched and snapped back again. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I stepped back, slowly at first, my eyes locked on the thing in the trees. It didn't follow me. Not yet. I turned and ran, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just wanted to get away. The fog seemed to thicken as I ran, swallowing the world around me. I could barely see the road beneath my feet, barely hear anything over the sound of my own panicked breaths. But I could feel it. It wasn't running after me. It didn't need to. It was just there, always just beyond the edges of my vision, always watching. I stumbled over a root and fell hard onto my knees, scraping my hands on the rough ground. My head spun, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. When I looked up, I saw the fire pit. I was back at the campsite. This time, I didn't scream. I didn't cry either. I just sat there, staring blankly at the ashes, too numb to feel anything anymore. My limbs felt heavy, like they were filled with lead. My mind felt detached, floating somewhere just above my body. I heard a sound, a soft, wet squelch, like something heavy being dragged through the mud. I didn't look up. I didn't need to. The sound stopped just behind me, and I felt it there, towering over me, its presence cold and suffocating. I closed my eyes, my breath hitching in my chest. "Go away," I whispered. It didn't. When I finally opened my eyes and turned, it was standing at the edge of the tent, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on me, its crooked smile stretching wider and wider. It didn't move. It just watched. The moment I saw it standing outside the tent, I knew it wasn't going to kill me. Not yet. If it wanted to, it already would have. It was playing with me, drawing this out for its own twisted amusement. I could feel it in the way it stood there, its crooked grin stretching wider, like it was laughing at some private joke I couldn't understand. I wasn't going to sit there and wait for it to strike. I scrambled backward, forcing my legs to move even as they felt like jelly beneath me. I grabbed a stick, anything I could find, and hurled it toward the creature. The stick hit its chest with a dull thunk. The thing didn't even flinch. It just tilted its head, the smile never leaving its face. My heart was hammering so loud I couldn't hear anything else. I turned and bolted, running into the fog without a plan, without a direction. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. But the laughter followed me. It started low and guttural, like a growl bubbling up from deep within its throat. Then it rose, wet and gurgling, echoing through the swamp. It wasn't behind me anymore. It was everywhere, bouncing off the trees surrounding me. I didn't stop running. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I was dead. I stumbled over roots and sank knee-deep into mud, my hands clawing at the ground as I tried to pull myself forward. The swamp seemed alive, twisting and shifting around me, its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The laughter grew louder. It was enjoying this. At some point, I realized I couldn't keep running forever. My legs felt like they were about to give out, and the swamp was slowing me down, pulling at me with every step. I needed to stop, to think. I ducked behind a cluster of roots, my chest heaving, my fingers clawing at the mud to keep myself hidden. The fog pressed in close, wrapping around me like a damp, suffocating blanket. For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard it. Squish, squish. The The sound of something heavy, dragging itself through the mud. It was slow, deliberate, almost lazy, like it knew exactly where I was and didn't need to rush. I held my breath, pressing myself deeper into the mud. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. Eliot, the voice was raspy and wet, drawn out like a snake hissing through the trees. My stomach churned while rising in my throat. It knew my name. I needed to distract it. I grabbed a rock from the mud and flung it as hard as I could toward the opposite direction. It hit the water with a loud splash. For a moment, the dragging sound stopped. I didn't dare move. Then the laughter started again. Low, mocking. It wasn't fooled. It knew. I crawled through the mud, keeping low, my hands and knees sinking into the muck with every movement. My entire body was trembling, but I forced myself to keep going. The swamp seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, the fog obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The only sound was the squelching of my movements and the faint, intermittent dragging that followed me. Never too close, but never too far. That's when I saw it. A clearing, barely visible through the fog. In the center of it was something unnatural. Bones. The shrine looked like something out of a nightmare. It was a chaotic pile of bones, some animal, some human, all arranged around a shallow, stagnant pit of water. The bones were tied together with strips of sinew and vines, hanging from branches like grotesque wind chimes. Skulls grinned down at me, their empty eye sockets seeming to watch my every move. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The pit of water reflected nothing. It was black and still, like a hole in the earth. And there, sitting on top of the pile of bones, was something that made my stomach drop. A wedding ring. I recognized it immediately. I'd seen it on my dad's finger 1,000 times. I reached for it, my hand trembling, but before I could grab it, I heard the laugh again. It was close. Too close. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. Eliot, the voice hissed again, so close it felt like it was breathing on the back of my neck. I turned and bolted, leaving the shrine behind. I don't know how long I ran. The swamp became a blur of gray and green, my legs moving on autopilot as my mind spiraled into panic. Eventually, I couldn't go any further. My body gave out, and I collapsed into the mud, gasping for air. My hands clawed at the ground, smearing mud across my face as I tried to pull myself forward. Then I saw it. Through the fog, something massive loomed ahead. At first, I thought it was another tree, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a den. The entrance was wide and gaping, the mud and roots around it stained dark with something I didn't want to think about. Bones were scattered around the opening, cracked and broken, some still dripping with flesh. I wanted to turn back, but something pulled me forward. A horrible, morbid curiosity. I crawled closer, my heart pounding, and peered inside. And that's when I saw them. My parents. Their bodies were twisted and mangled, displayed like trophies. My dad's arms were pinned to the walls with jagged roots, his chest torn open, his face frozen in an expression of horror. My mom was on the ground, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. I couldn't scream. I couldn't cry. I couldn't move. Behind me, the laughter started again. Low, bit, guttural. Eliot, when they found me, I was lying in the mud near the car. I don't know how long I'd been there. Hours, days, maybe longer. Time had lost all meaning in the swamp. The fog had settled heavy over everything, muffling the sounds of the world, wrapping me in a blanket of gray silence. Holy shit, a voice said, cutting through the haze in my mind. Hey, there's a kid here. He's alive. I opened my eyes. The fog swirled, and through it, I saw two figures. A man and a woman, dressed like hikers, their backpacks bulging with gear. The man crouched next to me, his face etched with concern. Hey, buddy, he said softly, his voice shaky. You okay? Can you hear me? The woman stood behind him, her face pale as she scanned the swamp. What the hell happened out here? Where are his parents? The man shook his head. I don't know. He turned back to me. What's your name, kid? Can you tell us what happened? My throat was dry, my lips cracked, and caked with mud. When I tried to speak, the words came out as a hoarse whisper. It had smiled. The man leaned in closer, his brow furrowed. What? What smile? I swallowed hard, the memory slamming into me like a tidal wave. The grin, the glowing eyes, the laughter. It smiled. I said again, my voice trembling. Before it killed them. It smiled before it killed them. The man glanced over his shoulder at the woman, his face tight with confusion. She crossed her arms, her eyes flicking nervously to the tree line. Who killed them, kid? The man asked, turning back to me. I couldn't answer. My chest heaved, and tears spilled down my face. I buried my head in my hands, sobbing uncontrollably. It smiled before it killed them. It'll smile before it kills you too. The man and woman exchanged uneasy glances. Jesus, the woman muttered. What the hell do? We can't leave him here. The man nodded. We'll take him back to town. Let the cops handle this. This is way above us. They helped me to my feet, their hands firm but gentle. I leaned on the man as we made our way to their car, my legs barely able to support my weight. Every step felt like I was dragging myself through quicksand, my mind clouded with images I couldn't escape. Dad disappearing into the swamp, Mom's empty eyes staring at nothing, Lila's mangled body hanging in the tree. But the worst was the smile. That awful, crooked smile. The car was a battered SUV, its paint chipped and streaked with mud. The man opened the back door and helped me climb in, buckling the seatbelt across my chest. You'll be okay, kid, he said, though his voice wavered. We're getting you out of here. I nodded weakly, staring out the window as the swamp began to blur past. The fog clung to the trees, swirling in lazy spirals as the car rumbled down the dirt road. The woman glanced at me in the rearview mirror. Do you remember where your family was heading? Where you're from? I didn't answer. She sighed and looked at the man. Poor kid's in shock. The man nodded. Can you blame him? God knows what he's been through. As they talked, I felt a strange sensation crawling over me. It started in my chest like a knot tightening just below my ribs and spread outward, seeping into my arms and legs. My skin prickled, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Something was wrong. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, my eyes flicking to the window. The swamp seemed different now, closer, darker, like the trees were leaning toward the road, their gnarled branches reaching for the car. The laughter echoed in my ears, faint but unmistakable. No! I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was just in my head, but it wasn't. Hey, the man said, glancing at me over his shoulder. You right back there? You're looking kind of pale. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. My tongue felt heavy, my throat dry. The knot in my chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. My hands flew to my neck, my eyes wide as I gasped for air. Hey kid, the man shouted, pulling the car over to the side of the road. The woman turned in her seat, panic flashing across her face. What's wrong with him? I clawed at my throat, my vision swimming. The laughter grew louder, filling my head, drowning out everything else. And then suddenly it stopped. The knot in my chest loosened, and I sucked in a shaky breath, my body trembling. You okay, buddy? The man asked, his voice full of concern. I nodded slowly, wiping the sweat from my brow. My hands were shaking, my fingers caked with mud and dried blood. The woman turned back to face the road, her shoulders tense. Let's just get to town. The sooner we're out of this swamp, the better. The car started moving again, the engine rumbling as the dirt road turned to gravel. The man fiddled with the radio, but all he got was static. Damn thing never works out here, he muttered. The woman didn't respond. I stared at the back of her head, my mind buzzing with a strange, feverish energy. My reflection in the window caught my eye, and I turned to look. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. My face was pale, my eyes sunken and hollow. My lips were cracked and dry, twisted into a faint, unnatural grin. I blinked, and the grin widened. The car hit a bump, jolting me forward. The man glanced back, his brow furrowed. You sure you're all right, kid? I didn't answer. My reflection smiled back at me, its teeth crooked and jagged, stretching too far across my face. The laughter echoed in my ears again, louder this time. "Eliot," I smiled.